Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Ashley Martens. Ashley grew up under the canopy of trees in the western U.S. She gazed up at shimmering aspen leaves as a babe in Utah, sought shade under ancient junipers when hunting arrowheads in Wyoming, foraged wild mushrooms under old growth cedars and hemlocks in Idaho, watched bald eagles raise their young under a giant Douglas fir in Washington, and gathers her community together under cottonwoods along creeks in Montana. Her educational and experiential background in ecology, wildlife biology, education, restoration, and mindfulness primed her perfectly for work with the Old Growth Forest Network. Whenever she feels stressed or can't sleep, she imagines herself sitting on the mossy ground with her back resting against the soft trunk of a giant grandmother cedar tree. Welcome, Ashley. Thank you for joining us tonight and for sharing your stories. And from there, I will hand it off to you.
All right. Can you hear me all right? Great. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. I loved that Alex mentioned that little bio and that feeling, even her just saying it, right? Resting with my back against a grandmother cedar tree. And that's what this picture shows right here in the very intro. So I might just invite you for a moment just to imagine yourself there, maybe sitting with your back, against some of those buttress roots or between them, and your back resting against that soft bark of an ancient cedar tree covered in moss. Maybe you might imagine the temperature of the air in that place, the smells, you might sense the moisture. These are really special places, and we can feel this sense of awe and wonder in old growth forests of all varieties across our beautiful state of Montana. And I'm here to talk about that and what we do as an organization and how you might be able to help us. All right, so as Alex mentioned, I like to be a little more interactive. Otherwise, it just feels like I'm kind of speaking into space. I can see about 6 of you right now, but I'll scroll through every once in a while. But I'd love for you in the chat to go ahead and type in what comes to mind when I say old growth. No wrong answers. Hmm. Oh, I just turned my volume up. I'll do that too. Big trees, huge trees, wonder, ancient trees, redwoods, intact ecosystems, not logged, spring ephemerals, moss, peacefulness, ancient Ross Creek cedars. You got it. That was where that picture was from. White bark pine, old white bark pine, awesome. Dense forest, big trees. Yeah, nice. Moss, humidity, broken tops, wild, wise, fragrant, late Cyril, fabulous. Yeah, thanks everyone. Oh, yeah, so many things. I appreciate that. Spotted owl, lichens, nurse logs. Sweet. Yeah, we'll talk about all of those things. So, old growth forests are ecosystems that are challenging to define because they come in so many varieties. So lots of things come to mind, but even scientists who have studied them for decades will still argue about how to define them, whether it's quantification or qualities, things like that. So it's always nice to hear what people think and then expand on that idea beyond maybe any limits that you might have. And this, you all kind of touched on this already, so you can add more to the chat if you want to, but otherwise, some of you already mentioned, feeling awe or wonder or a sense of peacefulness. I myself often feel in particular kinds of old growth forests with really big and tall trees, a sort of a sense of smallness or insignificance, but also somehow vastly connected to something big at the same time. So all kinds of ways that we feel when we are in an old growth forest. So why should we care about them? A little bit of my talk is going to be about that, in addition to the challenge of trying to define them and locate them. But a big question that I'll come back to in the end is why. And I thought I'd mention now that the very top of the chat, there is a form that you can fill out if you're interested in helping us. I'll talk about that at the end with adding more old growth forest to the network in the state of Montana, and also signing up for a field trip that I'll be doing in the Bozeman area. So I just want to let you know that that's up there because we'll come back to the why and then the how at the very end. So that's in the top of the chat if you are interested in knowing about that right now. So let's just skip that. So, like I said, it's really hard to define an old growth forest, right? If you can see, this picture is actually a picture of my daughter ducking under a giant Douglas fir in Washington, so even further away than Montana, where that tree just really dwarfs her. And she's, 5'5" tall person. And most of us in the United States, at least, tend to think about old growth often as those West Coast big old trees, redwoods, um, Olympic Peninsula old growth forests. There's features that define old growth forests that we're going to explore a little bit more that go beyond just the presence of big trees. They're amazing. Some of the ways that we have worked with people to find old growth forests across our entire nation is working with big tree hunters and folks who find trees for the Big Tree Registry, and they're a great start. They're amazing, but they don't make an entire forest. So some features that contribute to making the complex and sophisticated system of an old growth forest are, of course, the big old trees, but also, as some of you mentioned, coarse woody debris, right? Downed logs, branches, pits and mounds, things like where trees fall over and it creates a pit in the ground or a mound. The complexity of an old growth forest and the biodiversity and abundance that is gained when an ecosystem is allowed to live out its natural life for hundreds, if not thousands of years is more than we understand. The complexity is more than we understand. And the more science we do, the more we realize how complex it is and how much we have left to learn. Lack of disturbance, or at least large scale disturbance. We'll talk about situations where an old growth forest might need a little help with disturbance because of other things that humans chose to do that they thought were right before. And then trees really standing the test of time. So those trees sometimes are big, but oftentimes they're gnarly, like the white bark pines that some of you mentioned, or ancient junipers that can be thousands of years old, but maybe not be more than 8 feet tall. So many varieties and so many different sort of climactic regimes. So we're going to think about old growth forests in the state of Montana as either a moister forest with more precipitation or a drier forest with less. And in a state like Montana, we happen to have, that band through the Northwest that can get really wet, and then drier forests as you move across the Continental Divide. So just take a few moments to look at this moist old growth forest features graphic And it talks a little bit about some of those things that I mentioned before, but also some of the things that you all mentioned when you think about being in an old growth forest of mushrooms and nurse logs and large dead trees. Um, Ghost logs are where you see these trees in a line in the forest where the nurse log has actually disappeared or become decomposed by the trees. There's patches and there's often uneven age classes. So it's not always just big old trees, but when a tree falls, it creates a gap in the canopy, the sunlight can reach the forest floor, and then younger trees that need sun might be able to grow up in presence of that. In contrast, dry old growth forest features. So several of you mentioned Ross Creek cedars, which was, I'll go back. This is another picture from the Ross Creek Cedar Grove, one of my favorite places on the planet. And then here's a place that I've not been, but that I've spoken at length with to at least one person in this presentation on Zoom about it, Steve Kletzel. Does anybody have a guess where this is? Steve, you don't get to guess, but me saying his name might give it away. Anybody want to mention that in the chat? Oh, I keep losing the chat. There you are. Eastern Montana. Oh, and I'm seeing some things, low trunk taper. Someone saying they can't see the screen share. I'm guessing you can tend to that, Alex. Can everybody else see the screen share? Give me a thumbs up if you can. I can see a few of you. Are you able to see my screen? Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, Prim Meadow. Okay. Yeah, so not far from Sealy Swan, but Prim Meadow, an old growth ponderosa pine dominated forest that actually has quite different understory because of the drier soils, more sun, less shade, almost like more of a park-like setting with grasses and things as opposed to lots of shrubs in the understory, and has had a little help from humans because of some changes that we made on the landscape in the form of not allowing fire to burn for 100 years because we thought it was a good idea at the time. And now we're realizing how important the role of fire is. So as you can see in this graphic with the dry forest features, we have, not quite as much decomposition. There's less moisture, right? But we have trees often that will develop this thick platy bark. Ponderosas can develop this really thick puzzle piece bark that smells amazing, large horizontal branching. We still have dead trees and old trees with cavities and other microhabitats, but maybe a less amounts of things like the mosses and lichens and drippy wet things that we think of in the winter forest. So it's important to acknowledge that we have both dry and moist old growth forest types across the state of Montana. So this is just a quick look at stages of decomposition. As you can see, stage 1 is a live tree, and then stage 2, you might have, some kind of fungi, insects, all kinds of things creating opportunities for this to slowly start to decompose and die as a snag. And then eventually the bark falls away, it's clean, it breaks, it starts to fall, and it starts to decompose on the forest floor where it has access to more moisture than a standing dead tree does. But all are valuable for a variety of reasons to host habitat for all kinds of creatures and critters. So one of the things that really peaks in abundance in old growth forests, at least the moister ones, are the arthropod populations because there is more stable moisture and humidity, right? So we've got more insects, more spiders, more millipedes, more beetles, more all kinds of things in an old growth forest. This is a picture that helps you kind of imagine all of the places where an insect or a spider or a mite or something, could crawl and live and eat and hide in these wet downed logs. We also see the thriving of many kinds of mosses, club mosses, lichens that really thrive in these moist microclimates that are created in old growth forests, where the moisture ones that have shade pretty consistently throughout the year um, allow these plants to really thrive. So these are some pictures on the right of a lobaria, which is a lichen that actually really thrives in old growth. There's different species in Montana, some of them species of concern, and actually indicate good air quality. So if you think back to imagining yourself in an old growth forest and taking a deep breath, right, there is that sense of like fresh air, and that's very true because there are so many things that are helping to clean the air and purify it for you. This club moss, I've forgotten the name, but you all are the botanists, so you could probably help me with that one. But this one was taken in an old growth forest in Yellowstone National Park along the Thunderer Cutoff Trail. There's also many sensitive and other animal species that really thrive in old growth forests. The thing that most of them have in common is that they appreciate cavities or places to hide within big old trees. So our largest woodpecker needs larger diameter trees to create nesting cavities in. Flying squirrels need those to take refuge in. Fishers love older forests where they can hang out up on the bigger, larger branches and in nooks and crannies. And then even the brown creeper, that little bird at the top, they have much better foraging success in older forests because those thicker barked trees with those deeper fissures and furrows host more of those arthropods, that greater diversity, which means there was a study I quoted for a bird talk I did a little while ago, and I'm going to estimate this because I can't remember the exact numbers, but basically a brown creeper could either feed on one, quote unquote old growth tree that was, I believe it was like 3 foot or more diameter at breast height, compared to 10 or 12 6-8 inch diameter at breast height trees, right? So it could spend more of its time just on one tree, going around that trunk and gleaning insects out of the bark, than having to fly to the next and to the next. And also brown creepers have this sweet way of nesting underneath the flaking off bark of these old trees. So when they develop that really thick, craggy, platy bark. So all kinds of amazing critters, some of which are species of concern with climate change and habitat loss that do well in old forests. Some sensitive plant species also thrive in old growth. I'd love you all's help fleshing this out a little bit. I was trying to find some species that did really well in dry old growth forest types, and I was really unsuccessful. So I'd love for you to share that with me if so. But in these wet old growth forest types, the batriciums or the moonwort species, several of them are species of concern in Montana, and several of them really thrive in old growth forests across our state, especially in the Northwest. So back to the why. Why are old growth forests important? Well, some argue that it is our best natural solution to buffering rapid climate change and especially warming. You can see this chart shows how the forest carbon index, which is a measure of carbon storage potential, increases as a forest ages. In addition, we also have cooler surface temperatures because of that forest cover. So not just the storage, but the cooler temperatures that you can imagine yourself on a blistering hot August day in Montana and being able to seek some shade under the branches of a big old tree to escape the heat for a little while. And we've learned that that carbon storage is not just in the big trunks of the big trees, but also in the roots and the branches and a tiny bit in the leaves. So the carbon storage runs deep, and those natural systems that are in place after an ecosystem evolves, after hundreds, if not thousands of years, is really sophisticated in terms of nutrient exchange. We've got really advanced soil. The soil is complex and rich. We've got advanced nutrient cycling. As I mentioned with the lichens before, there's a purification effect of mitigating pollution, cleaning our water, right? When we have old forests in our watershed that are healthy, then our water systems can be really clean. Fish habitat can be great when those big old trees fall across streams and create riffles and pools for fish and other species, and releasing all sorts of that fresh air oxygen. So the next question is, where is it? Where is it in Montana? And we looked at a couple of examples, but we're going to explore that a little more deeply. So this is something I got from the DNRC, I guess, Department of Natural Resources and Conservation. But basically anything that's not beige is some kind of forested region. So that they really are just listed into regions, so it's not necessarily about forest community types, but I just wanted you to get a sense of our state. And as you know, the eastern part of the state doesn't have nearly as many forests as the western part of the state, hugely due to climate effects. And also the where are our Montana forests in general, majority on national forest land. Second to that, non-industrial private lands. And then you can see smaller percentages for Park Service, BLM, state, tribes, right? And these are shifting a little bit as things move around in those smaller categories, but federal government, meaning the public and us, own most of these old forests. And so as a result, we get to have a say in how they're cared for. So when I mentioned the climate effects and where we find wet and dry forests, climate creates biomes based on temperature and precipitation, somewhat elevation, things like that. And so we can have all of these forests that you see in this red box in Montana, a little bit of temperate rainforests, temperate seasonal forests, woodlands and shrublands, boreal forests. Those are really broad categories. But these forests, without a lack of large scale, or with a lack of large scale human caused disturbance, creates old growth. Now, natural disturbance is slightly different. And then this is a great graphic that kind of shows when you're having a prevailing east moving wind into the state of Montana, and it's hitting the west side of the divide. Down low, we have these wetter forest types like cedar and hemlock. And then up higher on the west side, maybe we have some grand fir, larch, lodgepole, ponderosa, maybe some white pines in the northwest part of the state. Up in the higher elevations, we get into the subalpine forests with subalpine fir, Engelmann spruce, lodgepole, other mixed forests. We have some alpine larch. And then as the moisture kind of drops off on the east side of the divide, then we get warmer, drier, slower growing forests. And we have more Douglas firs, ponderosa pines, but again, at high elevations, white bark pines, lodgepoles. And then even lower and drier, we end up in these more woodland types that might be dominated by things like junipers. So I want to touch on a handful of the old growth forest types in Montana. There's at least 16 that are listed by the Natural Heritage Program, Forest and Woodland Ecosystems. I'm not going to go into detail on all 16 of those, but I do want to highlight a few and focus a bit more on the dominant overstory tree species like habitat types and things are often made. So we'll start with the quintessential, that's as close as we get to the West Coast old growth forest that most people think of. And we're back to places like the Ross Creek Cedar Grove with these rare, sometimes Botrychium moonwort species, or at least very inconspicuous, that grow underneath these ferns and things. So lots of different varieties of ferns. And then my favorite in the lower right corner is the wild ginger plant. That's whenever I'm on the west side, that's my nature name is wild ginger because that's one of my favorites. And then as we move up higher, we get into these subalpine forests. So I had showed you the picture with the fairy slipper on the left before. This picture is taken up at Grotto Falls Trail, up highlight outside of Bozeman. Same as the picture in the center is the bark of an old growth spruce. And then on the left side, you see that old growth forest feature of a nurse log where the little spruce saplings are starting to sprout up along this mossy log, along with other varieties of plants. And then we'll go into a little drier site. So we have ponderosa pines both in the Rockies and on the Great Plains, so on both sides of the divide. They're slightly different in terms of understory, but I'll kind of cover these together for the sake of time. But you can see that gorgeous puzzle piece, thick, platy bark. If you've ever stuck your nose inside of one of those cracks, you know exactly what I mean by breathing in that scent. These giant towering trees that then eventually, because the decomposition is often slower, stay standing. So like on the left side, you see that there's these large cavities created by cavity nesting species. Those are probably made by pileatids or flickers, something like that, but then can be used later by all sorts of mammals, owls, things like that. And then that platy bark that slowly starts to fall away, which can create little microclimates and microhabitats for all kinds of other species. So everything has a place in an old growth forest and a function. And natural systems have evolved to sort of fill in all of those little niches and use them. So there's a lot of wisdom in the design, not all of which we've scientifically unraveled, but you can sense it and you can feel it when you're there. We have a lot of lodgepole pine, and full disclosure, I told one of the vegetation ecologists in Yellowstone that I said, I need you to convince me because I just kind of think lodgepole is boring compared to the other forest types. It just, feels more homogeneous, a little less complex. And he went on to tell me several reasons why I should appreciate old lodgepole forests more. We know them mostly for their serotinous cones and their dependence on fire to open, how they cover a huge amount of Yellowstone National Park. But this is along the DeLacy Creek Trail in Yellowstone. So I'm branching a little bit into Wyoming here with this talk because that's where I've spent more of my time since I'm based in Bozeman, but same ecosystem types. And then you can even see on the left that even as dry as some of these lodgepole forests can get, they can also have really moist pockets. And you can see this decomposing nurse log with little baby lodgepoles sprouting up from it. amidst that stand with not as much understory, a little bit more open and park-like, but not quite as large diameter trees or as dry and sunny as a ponderosa forest might be. And then one of the most common is the Douglas fir tree, and they're often in concert with other trees, so Douglas firs and mixed conifers. So here's a really giant with wolf lichen on its branches, those big horizontal branchings. You can see how thick that bark has become on that tree. There are living parts and there are dead parts. You can see how that tree's roots have even, or bottom of the trunk has gained a little bit of that buttressing like the old growth cedars do. And then when one of these big trees falls, like on the picture on the left, then we get these big tip ups. And then you have these microclimates that get created underneath that. When I looked into that divot underneath where that tree had fallen over and brought all that soil and such with it, there were all kinds of animal tracks and things. So habitats created galore when a forest gets to be wild. Here's some other examples of some mixed conifer forests. As we get a little higher in elevation, you can see in the picture on the left side of the trail in the middle, there's a Douglas fir, but in the foreground, there's an Engelmann spruce. So we've got a variety of tree species and multiple layers of decomposition, fallen logs, again, creating these different gaps in the canopy where smaller trees can start to grow up, other sun-loving plants can live. And then one more with a few wildflowers still left in the background, but just really showing the complexity of that, the tree, its trunk, the roots that are sort of above ground and below ground, and sort of hearkening back to that picture about carbon storage and how much carbon is really contained in the mass around that tree and that ecosystem. This is another mixed conifer forest. This was also Yellowstone area, but it could just as easily have been Glacier National Park. And I'm holding my bear spray up for scale. And what do you all think? I think that's a big bear scratch on that tree. Yeah. So this tree is probably, so if my bear spray is 7 or 8 inches across, then we could extrapolate that. That tree's at least 3 or 4 feet diameter at breast height. And there were scratches like that all over it. So I'm sort of imagining, right, that might be a landmark tree for bears. The picture on the right has the bark of a lodgepole scratched off to expose the cambium that something was feeding on. That could have been bison, that could have been bears. I took some pictures of hares, but this isn't a mammal presentation. So, but just to show, really illustrate, right, how much old forests really do create habitat. Some species only like to move through them or seek shelter in them. They're not exclusively related to them, but they are part of a wild ecosystem if the forest is allowed to live out its natural life. And then finally, someone mentioned the higher elevation old growth white pine. A lot of it, as you all know, has been impacted by blister rust, and we're doing our darndest as humans to try to select trees that are resilient and are not being killed by that to replace. This is a fellow member of Blackfoot tribe, up high elevation. You can see it looks like my caption got blanked out by the picture, so I apologize for that. But the photo credit in the caption said that was the remnants of what was dated as a 2,000-year-old white bark pine. You can imagine this multi-trunk living white bark pine on the right either could be multiple trees because a Clark's nutcracker forgot about its cache, or maybe some damage to that tree that created some splitting off of the main trunk. So some combination of that, but just really impressive complexity. And then from the highest mountains, we'll go back down and across to really the main forest types as we enter the more arid parts of the state of Montana are along waterways. And um, even though cottonwoods live fast and die young in terms of old growth, 200-year-old cottonwood's pretty darn old. A 400-year-old cottonwood is pretty amazing. Sort of like a 105-year-old human, which I do know one, so it exists, but it's not the norm. And as you probably know, as you can imagine, feel yourself walking through, a well-established old cottonwood or combination of cottonwood, aspen, galley riparian forest along a river in Montana, that there's full of birdsong in the springtime, all kinds of habitat, all kinds of water to nourish all kinds of life along these waterways. So I don't want to ignore these cottonwood riparians. And as you might have seen at the intro slide, our organization was founded in the East Coast, where a lot of the trees are deciduous trees, and a lot of the old growth forests are dominated by deciduous trees, most of them hardwoods, which cottonwood is not, but important to remember really just the variety that we're so blessed to live around in this state. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention Gus. Many of you, I'm sure, have visited Gus, the old growth western larch near Seeley Lake. And larch stands are often mixed conifer stands, but again, can withstand a lot of fire. And then on the right side, this is a picture, I believe it's in the Absaroka Beartooth subtype, but it could be up Glacier area. Someone might know from those peaks. But those alpine larch that grow much higher, but also can get really old and can be really resilient and adapted to disturbance by fire. Oh, the pintlers. Oh, Connie Geiger's here. Thank you, Connie. I thought anaconda pintlers. Great. All right. I needed some water myself. Okay, so that begs the question. We sort of go back to why, but also where is it not, right? We talked about where there are forests. And now we're going to talk about where old growth forests are not, as a way to try to help us kind of hone in on where old growth forests are. So I won't spend too much time on this history because we all know it, right? But we have seen a massive decline in virgin forest, which is another name for primary forest, which is another name for old growth forest. They sort of get used interchangeably, but can be slightly different. From the 1620s to the 1990s. The most dramatic impact, of course, is in the eastern part of the United States as westward expansion happened. And so, we know this story, right? Manifest Destiny, Pilgrim's Progress. Here's a ginormous ancient cedar tree. These pictures are all from the Montana history collections. So you can see these fellows working hard with axes and a crosscut saw to work their way through this western red cedar tree, which, gosh, that guy in the middle looks like he's got to be close to 6 feet tall with his knees bent. So you could just imagine the size of the diameter of that tree across. This is some logging in the Bitterroot Valley, probably of ponderosa pines, right? Eventually, we didn't have to do all of it by hand. We had more sophisticated tools. We started using horses to help us pull out timber. We started floating timber down the Blackfoot River. This is a log jam that covers the entire Blackfoot River. I believe this is south of Clearwater Junction, but if someone knows better, you could put that in the chat. That's 1925, right? So we're 100 years ago here. And then eventually steam engines were able to haul logs even faster. So a lot of the demand was from the East Coast because, right, those forests were cleared from east to west to begin, and there was more population after colonization on the East Coast. So the good news is we're lucky enough in the West to have, oh, and I couldn't skip that. Then we got logging trucks, right? So it just became easier and easier, more efficient for us to haul timber out. I should speak the caveat right now that we're not anti using wood, we're not anti logging, we're just pro protecting what is left of old growth forests across our country, and managing some forests for timber harvest, but letting the old growth forests be and or helping nudge them along towards a healthier state. So this goes back to the why, right? We have a mission to create a national network of protected and accessible old growth forests. And this network is not just dots on a map, although you can find all those dots on a map and directions to those forests across the country on our website, but so that people can remember them, really appreciate them, and then advocate for protection of ones that are not. So we really do like people to tap into those feelings that you get in an old growth forest that is really restoring to the human spirit and helps stoke our curiosity, brings us a little more peace and ease. So all ecosystems are valuable. We just happen to especially love old growth forests. And because it would be an impossible task to try to find every single one, our goal is to try to find at least one per forested county across our country. And we have 3 levels of forests. Our quote unquote network forests are our cream of the crop forests that are the most protected, the largest area. We have community forests, which are more embedded in urban areas, and forests that are a nice resource for people that maybe don't have a car or don't want to drive a car or just don't have the opportunity to get further out. And then also we have a private forest registry. So as I said, right, these old forests are really good for the earth for all of those reasons: carbon storage, cooling surface temperatures, cleaning air and water, but they're really good for the human soul as well. The picture on the left is our founder, Dr. Joan Maloof. She actually spoke in Bozeman at the Gallatin Valley Earth Day event about 4 years ago, so you may have heard some kind of talk from her in the past. I think she also spoke in Missoula the year before that. And then the picture on the right is a group of international students at an old growth forest in Utah that I, hosted a dedication for earlier this year. A beloved forest called the Tony Grove Recreation Area outside of Logan up in the Cache Valley. So I mentioned dots on the map. So you will see that this is our current highest level network forests across the country. Now, sort of like the Pilgrim's Progress and westward expansion, our organization started in the Northeast, so you will see a higher concentration of dots on the map in the Northeast, and then we spread into the Southeast, and then on to the Pacific Coast. And I'm the first person that's ever been hired to be the Intermountain West regional manager and start to fill in this map with dots in states like Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, even Eastern Washington and Oregon. But zooming back in on Montana, you can see that right above Spokane is that one little dot on the map that we have in the state of Montana so far, and that is the Ross Creek Cedar Grove, probably the most well-known and beloved old growth forest in the state of Montana. It's got protections as a special interest area, and everyone loves it. So under no threat of timber harvest for commercial reasons. Um, you can also see here as I break it down into counties. So if our goal is to try to identify one per forested county, and I'll toggle back and forth a little bit between this map and this one. I tried to overlay them and make it transparent, and I gave up because it took me too long. So I don't have the tech skills for that. But any of those green areas, right, if you overlay that in your mind over all of this map of counties, have potential forests within them that we would love to recognize and celebrate as part of the Old Growth Forest Network. We do this, again, to help people connect with them, but then eventually over time, we hope that we become a bit more of a repository for research on old growth forests on a national level. So there are goals that go beyond this initial sort of acquisition of dots on the map and connections with people to enjoy them. So you'll also see in Missoula County that there is a green triangle, which represents a community forest. So our community forest is a little less stringent than the network forest. And again, they're embedded near communities. So we dedicated Greeno Park this past year into the community forest network. And we're looking ahead for a community forest here in Gallatin County soon. And hopefully lots more of those green triangles across the forested parts of Montana as well. So you might ask, what qualifies for an old growth forest network forest? Well, our line in the sand is that it's protected from commercial logging. We'll talk a little bit about fire dependent ecosystems as we go on here, because I know that's a complex issue that we're working through. They're relatively accessible, meaning that you don't have to be an extreme athlete to get there. They're open to the public so that people can visit them at least seasonally when they'd like, and as mature as possible. So there are counties in the East where every inch of original forest was used and or died naturally, or was cleared for sheep grazing or things like that. And so some of the forests in our network that are dots on the map on this in the eastern part, you can see some of them might be now being dedicated into the old growth forest network as future old growth. So second growth that's maybe reached 150 years old and is now being managed to just continue to become old growth. So if you've ever lived in the Northeast, you know that those forests are much wetter, which means super cool things like little salamanders and frogs and things all over in logs and on the forest floor. A lot of hardwood leaves, falling down and creating some rich soil and habitats for those moisture-loving amphibians. But fire was not quite as important part of a role as it on the natural ecosystems, maintaining them as in the longleaf pine forests of the Southeast, and as we know very well, in the West. So the approach has to be slightly different out here. But back to, our line in the sand is we don't want a dot on the map. You can go to our website, you can click on every one of those dots on the map, and it will tell you where that forest is, how to get there, if you've got to pay for it, what are the dominant tree types, etc. And then, and we don't want anyone to plan a trip to go visit a forest and find out, oh, it's been logged. So that's our line in the sand. And then the other parts make it a little, I think somebody's unmuted. Somebody unmuted? Just check to make sure. I'm just hearing a little extra feedback. So some common policies that qualify are listed here. Federal protection, some state parks. California State Parks has no commercial timber harvest on any of their state parks, only restoration forestry activities and prescribed burning. So like a state like California is easy to work with on the state park level, but not every state is the same as that. Sometimes it's counties or municipalities. Sometimes it's the Nature Conservancy or a land trust. Oftentimes, the Nature Conservancy or another land trust will then sort of give that property over to another entity similar to these, or even a tribal entity. Um, so sometimes we have to work to elevate these protections, but what we are not is we are not a forest watch organization that has lawyers on staff that is suing, for updating for a timber sale or for updating a forest plan or things like that. We just don't have the capacity to do that. So we're trying to work to really celebrate what has been well protected and then hopefully use that to advocate for more. So here's the big question, right? The fire question. So what about fire? So this is a forest that I did a dedication for into the Old Growth Forest Network called Sugar Pine Point State Park in the west shore of Lake Tahoe in California. And as you can see, there's fire scars here. So there was a lot of prescribed burning. This fellow right here, he was on the fire team and he was telling us about some of the prescribed fires that they were doing in this sugar pine forest to try to just open up the understory and really support the old trees that are there. So this kind of restoration activities might be applicable in Montana in ponderosa pine forest, in some of the lower elevation larch forests, things like that. So we fully recognize that fire is an important player in these old forests, and in many of them it was not allowed to burn, and so we're trying to figure out ways to sort of step in and nudge that process back to health with light-handed thinning possibly and some prescribed fires. So fire's definitely always something that we're trying to figure out how to thread the needle around and manage with, and it's hot topic, haha. So I'm just about to wrap it up here, but I had mentioned before that there at the top of the chat that there's a form that you can fill out if you're interested in getting a little bit more involved. But I am one person that works part-time, and because we do not have a West Coast person, my job is to fill in basically as many dots as I can in the forested parts of the entire western half of the country, which is obviously impossible. But we depend on volunteers a lot in order to help us do that. So part of the reason I'm giving this talk is just to help you recognize more old growth forest features when you're out in forests, or lack thereof, but also because I'd love your assistance in any way that you might be able to. So there are a couple of ways that you might be able to help. One is just to head out on forest trails, especially if something pops into your mind that's like, oh, this forest would be a really cool forest for the network to represent such and such county. You visit, you take some notes, you take some pictures, you have a good time, you come back and you tell me about it, right? Send me an email with your thoughts, your pictures, and then I or you, if you're comfortable, might then take it to the next step and start to talk to the land manager or whoever owns that land to see if there's potential for inclusion in the old growth forest network. Other things, and this is part of the form in the link in the chat that you can sign up for, or simply sending me nominations of forests that you know of that I can try to investigate more that might be good candidates for the Old Growth Forest Network. I mentioned visiting the potential forests. You can attend a field training on how to recognize these old forest features. If you're still not feeling quite confident enough to recognize them on your own, the first one will be June 23rd at the Grotto Falls Trail outside of Bozeman. So there's a way to sign up for that field trip and field-based training with me on that form. And then one of the most exciting parts of these dedications is to actually have a celebration. And so here's some pictures of some forest celebrations. They're a really beautiful opportunity for a different group of people to come together, remember their common ground, remember how inspiring and nourishing and important that old forests are for human health. This is a whole group of people of all ages in Utah at a dedication, and then and this is a network forest on the right, and then on the left is my beloved county coordinator Mike Cantor in Missoula, who is also working on some old growth forest nominations for me in Ravalli County into the Bitterroots, and that was at a forest celebration. About 50 people at Greeno Park for the community forest dedication. We usually have nature walks. We sort of share our love for the forest and figure out how we can work together and also just really have a good time. And what I've learned in this past year more than anything is, there are so many difficult things going on in the world, and those are not to be ignored. But we also need to remember joy and connection and celebratory things in places where we can come together and acknowledge a good thing and celebrate and recognize it. So I'll leave you with these few photos before I open it up to questions. On the left, you can see, I can feel the awe in the picture here of this woman with an ancient juniper. This is a private forest that we just inducted into the Old Growth Forest Network, actually in Colorado. Ancient junipers, some of these thousands of years old. They've named and inventoried over 400 of them on their land. Here's a retired high school teacher and a kiddo measuring and hugging an old growth spruce tree. And then on the right is, the playfulness that gets stoked, excitement that gets stoked when one is in an old growth forest. And if you've ever been to the Ross Creek Cedar Grove, I hope you've climbed inside of this tree because it's, one of the quintessential things to do there is stand inside of this dead tree, and you can actually see bits of the sky now out of it. So with that, I will open it up to questions, and I hope I gave you a good introduction to old growth forests in Montana, how and where they might show up, and how and where you might help us. All right, Alex, why don't you let me know how we should?
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much, Ashley. That was, yeah, that was just, I love the way the um program kind of followed the topography and the different ecosystems. Thanks for taking us through that. Um, I think we do have some lingering questions in the chat, um, which I'm gonna scroll back.
I just posted the form again too because somebody mentioned that they didn't see the link to the form. So
Fantastic.
I don't know if we can pin that or
Let's see.
I
Um,
don't know how to do that, but
yeah, I'm not sure either. I do see it there. And feel free, folks, if you for some reason can't access it during this presentation, just email me and I will get it to you, no problem. Um, and so maybe we'll just start with Michael's question. Sorry, I had to step out for a second, so I hope you didn't have to. Have you answered Michael's question of what size of forest is worth considering for inclusion?
no, I sort of lost track of the chat because there was lots of things. So,
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
so great question. So for our network forests or sort of those highest level publicly accessible forests, a minimum of 20 acres, which sounds sort of ridiculously small for a forest out west. But remember, we started back east where, maybe that 5-acre patch of forest was all that was left in, a particular county. So 20-acre minimum. But then we also know that, old growth is also patchy and a mosaic, just like fire is, right? Where it will sort of be retained on the landscape. So 20 acres is our somewhat flexible line, but I think in this part of the country we can go bigger.
And I know we talked a bit about kind of the different aspects of fire, but Connie early on asked, how does an old growth lodgepole forest meet a definition of old growth when they often burn? Or in other words, how does fire change a forest's definition of old growth?
How does fire change? Is that the main question?
Um, yeah, it sounds like if things are burning regularly, does does the definition of old growth kind of do you still have to go back to that same like is it still based on age in the same way?
Okay, yeah, I got it. So it depends on if it's a stand replacing fire or not, right? So if it's a stand replacing fire, then wipes out all of the trees, succession sort of starts over again. Because we don't have any of those sort of microhabitats or like sun and shade like we would in an old forest. So it really depends on the severity of the fire. As we know, after a century of fire suppression and climate change, things like that, right, we are having more catastrophic stand replacing fires. And so, people who understand the role of fire on these fire dependent forests are doing a really good job trying to come in and figure out how do we maintain these old growth forest characteristics and features, but introduce a little fire in there to nudge it back on the trajectory that it was headed before we kept fire out for 100 years. So, it's a fine line dance, and I feel like Steve, if he's still on this call, will be the best person to speak about that fine line. But it's careful work, and they're trying to be really intentional. But we humans, we experiment with things. We thought that keeping fire out was a really good thing for 100 years, and now we're realizing that maybe not. So yeah, hopefully that helped.
Yeah, I think that certainly kind of yeah, that helps me think more about because even though it's not necessarily I think we're stepping away from using the ideas of good and bad for
Mm-hmm.
fire and just kind of looking a little bit more objectively at it as a fact of part like of our specific ecosystems, especially out west, like you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, a fact that we're all becoming more and more familiar with. So Andrea posed a question regarding your work specifically, which was um, starting with her statement, the national forests have done a lot of old growth surveys. Are you working with each forest to acquire their information on where old growth forests have already been documented?
Yes, absolutely. And because of the work with the old growth amendment that, Trump canceled, um, we know where it is, but it comes back to that, how do you define it? Because I was at a forest that was, 100% hands down, looked, felt, seemed to function like an old growth forest, which was actually in the Tetons, so in Wyoming, but still greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And the botanist on staff said, "Oh, yeah, we know this is old growth, but if you look at the criteria they made us measure, it doesn't qualify." So, right, because there was like three criteria. It was like X number of trees DBH, and then like a certain amount of basal area that was covered, and then maybe a certain amount of dead wood. I can't remember what those criteria were, but they were very quantifiable numbers. And so, even a forest might, oh, it barely didn't make it. Like the botanist showed me, like, oh, look, this number was just a teeny bit too low. So it was like, nope, this is an old growth. And as we know in the Intermountain West, right? I mean, it could just be like slope and aspect could totally change the growth rate of a particular stand of trees. And so that's where There was an entire old growth forest conference in the Northeast in Vermont that we co hosted in October. And there was a whole panel of people who had studied and researched and tried to define old growth for decades. And they said, you know what, we want to stop with the definition. We're never going to agree upon it. We're going to have to look for these features, this complex structure and function. And, that's not numbers. So that's harder for people sometimes to get their minds around. So circling back, yes, I am working with those. Some Forest Service personnel are extremely excited about working with us, and other ones do not want to have their name associated with the phrase old growth. As you can imagine, various reasons why. Um, Federal land is public land, and so technically it belongs to us as long as it is protected from commercial logging, like wilderness areas or research natural areas, and there's local people on the ground that want to celebrate that forest. It doesn't necessarily stop us, but if we can have the Forest Service involved, at the Ross Creek Cedars dedication, the district ranger gave remarks with me about the cathedral-like quality of the forest, and that was lovely to have him on hand to do that. But not every dedication does a Forest Service person want to show up, so that was a big fat mouthful about that. Which has made my job
Yeah.
more challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like there's maybe lists that have been created that maybe aren't as comprehensive as they could be. Like maybe some spaces have been excluded because of some potentially arbitrary facts or quantifiers.
Yes, that, and also if that old growth is not within a designated management area that is off limits to commercial timber harvest, then it doesn't fit our criteria. That doesn't mean we don't want to speak up for those threatened forests, but in terms of belonging to the network, we need to know that those trees will stay where they are until some natural disaster.
Mm, mm. That I wanna interject a question before we move on to the next question because I am not muted. Um, what um what kind of carrot can you offer, or like what have you seen to act as incentive for landowners to integrate their or to seek the old growth designation and become part of the network?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and we get that a lot. So, one answer to that is it's a real sense of community pride, and a recognition of the efforts of and able to tell a conservation success story. So oftentimes at a dedication, we'll celebrate a conservation success story, that multiple groups had to come together, or some random like senator from some state brought a book to the president with a picture of some beautiful forest, and then signed it into law. It's like, oh yeah, okay, we'll put that into wilderness. So I mean, there's some really amazing stories out there. So sometimes that's a carrot, is just sort of acknowledging the good work that people have done on federal lands. Right, there's a lot of time that especially land managers aren't getting patted on the back for what they did. And we're not trying to greenwash, but we are trying to say, like, let's acknowledge
Yeah.
what has been done well. We also can write letters of support and have been successful helping people get funding for trail improvements, things like that. Or we can partner with local conservation organizations to sort of boost their outreach efforts. There's no cost, there's no obligations to joining the network. So we make it a very sort of low investment for the land managers to be part of it. Yeah. Usually a forest dedication is motivated by some local person, whether it be a volunteer like one of you, or, to celebrate a beloved forest, or by a local conservation group that stewards that particular area.
Great. Um, let's see. It looks like Jim asked, what is, quote, restoration forestry? Um, let's see. So any merchantable timber cut to promote old growth characteristics to restore is is piled to burn or masticated. Sorry, I don't think I'm phrasing that exactly, but let's just stick to the basics. Yeah, how do we define restoration forestry?
Well, that's another argument. So I think even foresters would not all agree on that either. And so, again, that's like a thread the needle, but as light handed as possible in order to nudge the forest back to um, a function that would have been impaired by some human intervention. And so, that forest that I mentioned in California, the sugar pine forest, they literally only thinned with hand tools, right? They walked in with chainsaws in hand. They burned a couple of piles. They did prescribed burning, right? They didn't try to compact the soil with heavy machinery. So that was them being as light-handed as possible. Sometimes there might be a little heavier hand in other situations. So it's sort of a relative case by case, but commercial as soon as money gets into it, then it gets more complicated because if you're going to pay the people to haul the logs off, they have to haul enough logs to make enough money to make it worth the effort. And so, it gets sort of muddled in there, and I don't have like a very clear stance on like this is absolutely in and this is absolutely out because it tends to be a bit more case by case based on the forest.
Sure, yeah, and it seems like more and more, just in reading articles and seeing examples of uh, controlled burns, and fire being used to kind of rehab a forest in a way like it maybe originally would have been tended before we eliminated fire for those 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, just like you said, based on where we are and what kind of forest, it could look really different.
Yes, absolutely.
Um, let's see. I think we made it through the chat, but we still have a bunch of people in here with us. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask, or you can still enter it into the chat or unmute yourself and ask that way. I think it's just so exciting to think about kind of
Yeah,
clearly
this
from
is
the, oh yeah,
this is Jim Cancroft. I just threw that out there because I was involved in a project in northwest Montana where the property was a land swap between the state, some private landowners, and it was under an easement with the land trust. And the whole premise of the land trust was, well, it was put in the trust to promote old growth characteristics and beautiful old trees, a lot of decadence, but there was a lot of encroachment that had been coming in from lodgepole pine and Doug fir that hadn't been there. And so we did an inventory and we looked at, how can you promote these old growth trees? Well, part of it was you had to periodically cut out the competing trees that historically probably weren't there, never there because of fire and other stuff. So that's all what that was. Me as a forester and a biologist, the whole thought of commercial timber. Well, a lot of people need that little extra income to make projects happen. And I know old growth is old growth. I'm very aware of that. but there are opportunities where these unique stands in some of these habitats, um, unique old larch stands, pine stands that are now been encroached on by Douglas fir because of climate or lack of fire. So that was my point with that.
Yeah.
They're
And I
still
totally,
beautiful and they've got all the characteristics. And over time, my sense, if you're from the Northeast or a lot of those old growth stands, I grew up back there. But where I grew, the town I grew up in was 1680. It was all clear cut. And now you look back at these areas and these trees are just beautiful old oaks and different stuff. And they probably classify as old growth for you back there, where in the West, it's a little different.
yeah, thank you for that. And, you know, because we were founded in the Northeast and our founder, thought of most all forests as Northeast kind of forests, like you just let the forest do its thing. That's been a big edge that I've been trying to push and expand boundaries around what management activities are suitable to sort of nudge a forest back to health. And so in the situation that you described, it makes total sense, right? And I agree, right? Sometimes, like, even if it's just like the local guy, that has a small timber operation down the road, right? Like he needs to make a little bit of money here, and so there has to be a little incentive there. So in that situation, that particular piece of land, for example, might very well qualify for the network now that those activities have been done, as long as the idea is not like, oh, we're just going to keep doing that, all the time, but that maybe we're going to use some tools like prescribed fire at some point, or maybe we're just going to come in and hand then after that, right? Once we've done like the bigger sort of restoration forestry project. So I think that a place like that could still absolutely qualify, once it's recovered a little bit from maybe what might have been a little heavier handed management.
Thanks, Jim, for that comment and question. Um, Anyone else want to ask Ashley anything or comment before we don't have her face to face anymore? Yeah, Helen, go ahead.
Ashley, about 20 years ago, my husband and I drove down the East Coast from Maryland, where we lived then, and through Western Virginia and across the original Cumberland Gap, which is now a park and you can walk across it. You don't have to drive through it anymore. And then we went into Eastern Kentucky and we went to an old growth forest there. And I had actually talked to, this was before, I think, the Old Growth Forest Network. I had talked to the people at the Nature Conservancy and asked them if there was any old growth forest in the coastal plain of the East Coast, the middle part of the East Coast where we lived. And they pretty much said there was absolutely none. And they have put a few markers in now because those people did tell me of some very old trees, that had been clear cut at least once, but it had been a long time since they were clear cut, since, Maryland was settled in the 1600s. Um, anyway, but this old growth forest that we saw in Kentucky was amazing. You had to make an appointment to see it, and the guide met you a long way from the actual forest. It was considered that precious to the people there. And it's all totally fenced with big wire fences. And he took us into the place, and I could see why they considered it so precious because they were like enormous walnut trees and things like that. It was totally open underneath. It was like nothing I'd ever seen in my life before. And I grew up in Kentucky. Um, but it was an amazing experience to see deciduous trees that were that old and they were that enormous, and to see a forest that looked like that because nothing I'd ever seen before it, because Kentucky's just like a jungle. Everything is so lush there. But there's no understory there because these trees were so huge and the leaf cover way up over your heads was so complete. Um, and walnuts, which were some of the big trees that we saw there, of course, have that jugland stuff that kills the plants that grow too close to it. Um, but it was one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had. So I think it's really great that this old growth forest network exists now, because I went looking a long time ago and it didn't.
Yeah. Thank you, Helen, for sharing that. And hi, we've met
Hi.
before. Um, I mean that what you were speaking about, and I can feel it when you were describing it, right? That's the feeling that we want people to access, right? When people feel that in the natural world, then they're motivated to take better care of the planet. And, we all need that sense of awe and inspiration for our souls and, yeah, for the future. So I'm glad you got to have that experience. I want to too someday. Yeah. I learned just recently that they think one of the oldest forests in the country is like some random place in Oklahoma. What? I mean, I'm not from Oklahoma, but it's like, oh my gosh. I mean, there's really cool like expressions of old forests and complex ecosystems that are hundreds to thousands of years old all over the place. And this is finally a place, a one-stop shop place you can find a lot of them. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
Listening to Helen, it makes me think how cool it'd be for, and you probably get a degree of this when you talk to people, but like testimonials about each of these places and just capturing either in writing or recorded just people's experiences firsthand.
Yep, absolutely. That's why the forest celebrations are so fun because we all feel it together. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else while we have Ashley on the line? Really good crowd tonight. We had, I think I saw the number maxed at 118, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
Um, really wonderful to have so many people. And yeah, if no one else has a question, I want to let you go, Ashley, and get back to your evening. But thank you so much for sharing and for I think there's a ton of thank yous in the chat. Um, and clearly people got a lot out of this, but something that's really special about this talk is not only the information, but the opportunity to get involved. So thank you for sharing that with us. And I hope that there's, I know everyone has busy lives, but I hope that a couple contacts come out of this.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. I mean, I only, I have the best job in the world because I just get to be friends with people who love forests and trees. And, we go out and enjoy them together and celebrate them. And, I mean, it really is a lovely way to connect with people and remember what we have in common. And yeah, remember the good things in this world. It's really important. So thanks everybody
Absolutely.
for coming. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Farewell.
Mhm.